If you haven't heard, NASA is going back to the moon with its Artemis program. The current goal of landing humans on the surface by 2024 is very ambitious, if not impossible at this point. But it's very possible that we could see people walking on the surface before the decade is out. NASA has already completed the Orion capsule, which is meant to bring people to the moon and back, and they're working on finishing up the SLS rocket designed to send Orion to the moon. That leaves just one piece, which is what we're here to discuss today. The Human Landing System, or HLS, is just a vehicle to bring astronauts from the Orion and lunar orbit to the surface of the moon and then back to Orion at the end of the mission. NASA has left the design of the landing system in the hands of the commercial companies that bid for it, following in the footsteps of things like the Commercial Cargo and Commercial Crew programs, which got us all kinds of incredible vehicles like SpaceX's Cargo Dragon 2, and Crew Dragon vehicles, as well as Northrop Grumman's Cygnus, Boeing's Starliner, and Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser. So the same way that the commercial crew and cargo programs gave birth to a wide array of vehicles, all designed for the same purpose, NASA's HLS bidders have come up with some very different solutions to bringing humans from Orion to the surface of the moon. These differences have led to a lot of debate and discussion in the space community, so I wanted to make a video to better understand how I feel about these landers and how I think NASA should feel about these landers. So let's take a look. Now NASA has already narrowed it down to the final three contenders: National Team, Dynetics, and SpaceX. Let's start by looking at National Team, which is the combined effort of four giant aerospace companies. Blue Origin is serving as the prime contractor and is responsible for building the descent element, which will bring people safely down to the moon's surface. Lockheed Martin is handling the ascent element, which will bring them back to the also Lockheed Martin designed Orion in lunar orbit. Northrop is providing the transfer element, which starts the lander on its journey to the moon, and Draper is in charge of descent and guidance flight avionics. Next is the Dynetics Alpaca. This is a single element lander, but it has a few tricks up its sleeve that we'll get into later. Now Dynetics might seem like a smaller name compared to the other finalists, but they have a long history in spaceflight, including work on the SLS and Orion vehicles involved in the Artemis program, and they've actually assembled quite an impressive team themselves, with some huge names such as Draper, Sierra Nevada, ULA, Maxar, and L3 Harris. And finally we have SpaceX, who bid a variant of their next generation launch vehicle, Starship, specifically designed for the lunar environment. So I came up with a criteria to compare these very different vehicles, and when I was developing the criteria, the one question I was asking myself is, how can these vehicles make Artemis successful? And to answer that question, we have to understand what Artemis is. And whenever NASA is asked, hey, what is Artemis? Why is it different than Apollo? They say two things: we're going sustainably, and we're going to stay. So that's why sustainability is my number one criteria. Sustainability can mean a lot of things, but in this case, what I'm talking about is the ability to continually go to the moon. So sustainability will include things like reusability, which helps with cadence and cost. Speaking of cost, sustainability includes price. We can't have one item of the Artemis program sucking up all the funding. It's a sure way to hurt the entire program. And other things like ISRU, in situ resource utilization. These things are important for making the missions on the moon last longer and be more efficient. After sustainability, the next criteria is base building. Base building is obviously important if you're wanting to stay at the moon for any amount of time. You need some place to stay. And base building is something a lot of the Artemis documents actually talk about. They have a name for the first base, FSH, or Foundation Service Habitat. So it's something that NASA is paying attention to as well. My next category is a little more broad. It's design. And this encompasses whatever unique features a lander has that gives it a special kind of utility that could help Artemis. Design also has all the considerations for safety, simplicity, ease of use for the astronauts, and how the design might impact science and mission objectives of Artemis. The next category is challenge of the concept, and this criteria deals with the technical difficulty and risk associated with the lander design. So you may be thinking, why is such an important criteria so low on my list? I mean, it's not even in the top 3. Well, for one, it's low because I think all 3 of these lander designs are possible, and any of the 3 bidders could make their design a reality in the next decade, even though, of course, some are harder than others. But that's not the only reason. As I mentioned, the main difference between Artemis and Apollo is meant to be sustainability and staying there. If a lander could take a year or 2 longer to develop than another bid, but substantially increase the odds of keeping humans on the moon, then I think that's worth it. This is lower on the list because I think Artemis, unlike Apollo, should be about staying at the moon, not just getting there by some arbitrary date. That being said, design with less technical risk should be rewarded in some way. So the last category I was hesitant to even include, and that is moving on to Mars. Truth be told, I don't care about this category at all, but every single NASA document about Artemis constantly mentions that Artemis is a stepping stone to learn about stuff for our eventual journey to Mars. Large swaths of text is dedicated to this alone. Now, yes, before you say anything, I want to go to Mars. I love Mars. But I think a lunar lander should be evaluated on how well it lands people at the moon, not how well it could potentially bring us to Mars later on. To summarize, the 3 landers will be scored out of 100 points on the 4 main criteria: sustainability, worth 40, base building, worth 30, design, worth 20, and challenge, worth 10. They each have an opportunity to earn extra credit with the 5-point On to Mars category. Now for our top criteria of sustainability. Costs are a big part of sustainability, as much as we don't like to admit it. Of course, any lunar lander is going to be expensive to develop, but keeping costs down can help Artemis avoid any unwanted attention when the government starts eyeing budget cuts. It's also important to remember that HLS is just one part of a gigantic system meant to bring people back to the moon, all of which need their individual funding, and to a certain degree, the more money one part of the system consumes, the less there is to go around. Before we get started comparing exact costs, it's important to remember that this is early on in the program. Costs are estimates and subject to rise or fall, typically rising. Also, the only solid numbers we have are the development costs. We can only make educated guesses about unit and operation and launch costs. So let's take a look at the dev cost of our 3 contenders. National team asked NASA for $10.1 billion for their ILS lander. Dynetics wants $5.2 billion for the Alpaca, and SpaceX is seeking $2.2 billion for their lunar Starship. These are some big differences. Alpaca is more than twice the amount of Starship, and the national team is more than twice of Alpaca. It's hard to say what could account for these large gaps, but SpaceX is known for their very aggressive contract pricing, and their vertical integration is something that sets them apart in the aerospace industry. On the opposite side of the spectrum, National Team has maximized horizontal integration with 3 major primes. I'm not pointing any fingers, but Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin are pretty used to some big bucks from the government contracts. And Dynetics is the middle child between these 2 ways of thinking. Just one big prime contractor, themselves, and a large assortment of subcontractors, which makes sense why they're in the middle. Now, many people have noted that NASA could actually fund both Dynetics and SpaceX at a cost of $7.4 billion, still nearly $3 billion shy of the national team alone. I'm pretty sure, however, that NASA is not allowed to evaluate proposals this way, where they compare a combined value of 2 against 1, but who knows. Still, it becomes quite hard to justify the cost of the national team lander, and apparently this is on NASA's mind as well. Late last year, when these prices surfaced, Eric Berger said, quote, "The national team has been told essentially to never again submit a ludicrously high bid in comparison to its HLS competitors." Now, these proposals aren't just funded in a lump sum, but on a yearly basis. And for 2021, the HLS lander is only going to get $850 million. Let's see what annual funding each lander would actually require for a lunar landing by 2026, which is what I personally see as the earliest possible date. For the national team to fund their $10.1 billion development cost by 2026, they would need $1.87 billion per year from 2021 through 2026. Dynetics Alpaca would need $870 million per year to reach their $5.2 billion target, and SpaceX would need $270 million. NASA isn't necessarily wanting to narrow down to just one lander, so hopefully they start getting more money per year for the HLS system. But what happens if they don't? What if we're just stuck at $850 million per year for all of the Artemis program? Well, let's see how many years it would take for each lander to fully develop. For national team, this would take close to 12 years and finish by 2032. Dynetics would be about 6 years and finish in 2027. Not bad. The SpaceX Starship would require a little over 2.5 years, so let's just say 3 years of funding to finish development, ending in the year 2023. We're not quite out of the cost rabbit hole yet. Since we don't know actual unit costs, the only thing we can check out is estimated launch costs to get these landing systems to the moon. Launch costs are inextricably tied to vehicle reuse, which is also in our sustainability criteria, so let's just tackle them simultaneously. The national team would require 3 ULA Vulcan launches to assemble the 3 pieces of the ILS around the moon. Once the ILS has brought astronauts to and from the surface of the moon, what are we left with? Well, the transfer element can either crash into the moon or return to a low lunar orbit for refueling. Frankly, it actually makes more sense to just crash it, and here's why. The more delta V the transfer element imparts to the lander, the more payload the lander can bring to the surface. And to refuel the transfer element, you would basically just send another identical transfer element to lunar orbit just to refuel it. So then you're stuck in the exact same situation with one empty and one full transfer element around the moon. You're better off just expending it and getting more mass to the moon's surface and sending a fresh one up for the next trip. As for the descent element, there is some hope. Initially, it will just be left on the moon, which isn't great. But when ISRU, in situ resource utilization, is in place on the moon, it can refill its hydrogen and oxygen tanks to return to orbit for reuse. This is a big bonus because, as we'll see, Dynetics and SpaceX landers use methane for the propellant, which can't be made on the moon. The last piece of the system, the ascent element, uses hypergolic fuel and cannot be refueled as far as we know. And this is a major bummer because the ascent element includes the crew module, which is probably a pretty pricey piece of hardware, being that it's based on the $1 billion Orion capsule. So for each national team landing, the total cost would be the unit cost for the 3 elements, plus 3 launches to the moon on Vulcan for around $160 million each, or $480 million total. Later on, once ISRU is in place, you could subtract out the cost of the descent element and reduce the launch cost by 1 full Vulcan launch, bringing it to just $320 million per mission. Dynetics will also launch on Vulcan, but will apparently launch empty. Now, this hasn't been widely publicized, but as you can tell by these pictures, Dynetics has ditched the drop tank design and switched to just plain refueling. I actually feel like this is a great change. For one, your mass fraction improves. Now, instead of having 4 small tanks carrying around fuel, you have 2 big tanks carrying around fuel, which lowers the amount of material. Of course, this also makes Alpaca 100% reusable. No tanks falling into the surface of the moon during descent. Finally, it's easier to just transfer fuel in pipes and be done with it, rather than have mechanisms which attach and support the weight of new tanks and then have to release them during flight. The latest we've heard from Dynetics is that it will use 3 Vulcan launches to fully refuel, plus the initial Vulcan launch, which brings the Alpaca to the moon itself. Whatever fuel tanks are sent will be expendable, but it's just a tank, so it's not that pricey. This puts Dynetics' initial mission cost at the unit cost of the Alpaca lander, plus the unit cost of 3 refueling tankers, plus the 4 Vulcan moon launches at $160 million apiece, or $640 million total. But since the Alpaca is fully reusable, each mission after that will only be the unit cost of the 3 tankers and the $480 million to fly them. Last up, we have SpaceX. This one's complicated, and I spent way too long trying to figure out how many refueling missions it would take for the lunar starship. Without getting too far into the weeds, it depends on how much mass you want to take down, but it's anywhere between 8 and 12 refueling flights. The entire starship architecture is 100% reusable, that's the point. Now, estimates of a starship launch cost vary widely, with extreme optimism being less than $2 million per flight. This may be achievable long term, but we're talking the early days of Artemis just a few years down the road. This price would be shocking to say the least, but here's one way I like to look at it. It only cost SpaceX $28 million internally to launch a Falcon 9. That includes all the cost of transporting, inspecting, and recertifying the first stage booster. That includes the cost of building and expending the Falcon 9 upper stage and its Merlin vacuum engine. It includes the cost of refueling, launching the rocket with all the range operation fees, and it even includes the associated recovery efforts with the drone ship and fairing catching boats. Starship doesn't have any of this. It uses a cheaper fuel, it doesn't expend any engines or stages, and it doesn't require any recovery vessels since both stages land at the launch site. So we can say with a fairly high degree of confidence that a pessimistic estimate for the fully recovered Starship launch cost is less than $30 million. So taking that high estimate of launch costs and the highest number of refuelings, 12, we get a per mission cost of the Starship lander unit cost plus 13 total launches at $30 million apiece, or $390 million total. And remember, that is a pessimistic guess. And since the Starship system is completely reusable, future flights would only require the 8 to 12 refueling launches. So to summarize sustainability, we have the national team. The national team's development cost is borderline unjustifiable, especially next to the competition. Couple this with the expendable 3-stage design and it doesn't earn any points for the cost. But it makes up for it big time with its ISRU capabilities, being the only lander with a stage that can be fully refueled via resources on the moon. ISRU is a critical skill for humanity to learn, so great job here. And finally, 1 out of the 3 stages are reusable, and that's only after ISRU is in place. So I'll give the national team 15 out of 40 points for the sustainability criteria. Now for Dynetics. The Alpaca has a sensible development cost and a low per mission cost, giving it a pretty good score. And as for ISRU, as I mentioned, methane can't be made on the moon, but oxygen can, and most of a lander's fuel is actually the oxidizer. As for reuse, 3 tankers will be expended every time, but these are just 3 dumb tanks. The core vehicle, along with the engines, avionics, and crew module, is all fully reused. So considering all this, the Alpaca gets a great sustainability score of 30 out of 40. Now for SpaceX. Its $2.2 billion development cost is frankly hard to believe, but this is firm fixed price, so we know it's not going to go much over that. Couple this with full reusability means Starship knocked cost out of the park. As for ISRU, Starship's in the same predicament as Alpaca. The methane can't be made on the moon, but at least we get the oxygen. As for reuse, Starship is the only vehicle of the group that is 100% reusable, so it'll take first place here as well. So Starship ends up with a 35 out of 40 in sustainability. Now let's move on to the next criteria, my personal favorite, base building. Unfortunately, we don't have exact payload mass numbers for each of these landers, but NASA asked the industry for a minimum of 9 tons of payload down to the surface, but said they'd prefer 12. So I'm just going to go ahead and give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say they manage at least 12 tons to the surface. So if we have a volume to mass ratio the same of the ISS modules, a realistic base component for the moon that national team or Dynetics could take to the surface is about 50 to 90 cubic meters of living area, so not bad. But these 2 landers aren't exactly equal in this department. National team would need to unload the base module from higher than 20 feet in the air. I'm not so sure how possible this maneuver would be with a large 12-ton base module. In the worst case, this would mean having to downsize the base module that the national team lander can bring. In the best case scenario, it's just a complex and risky step. The Dynetics Alpaca lander features a unique low-slung design that actually allows it to carry payloads right to the surface of the moon, so setting a base module down would be trivial. As for SpaceX's proposal, Starship is a little crazy in this department. Again, depending on the refueling profiles, Starship can take 15 to 100 tons of payload to the moon's surface, and on the high end, that is more than 8 times what the other bidders are capable of. Keep that in mind when we think about refueling. 12 refuelings for a Starship may sound like a lot, but to bring 100 tons of payload down to the surface, the Dynetics or National Team's landers would require 24 launches of a more expensive expendable rocket. But back to the base building. While the Starship payload bay is by far the furthest off the lunar surface, it seems that offloading a base module from Starship would actually be easier than it is for the National Team lander, and this is mostly due to scale. Starship can pack a large crane or elevator to offload the base module, which is just a negligible percentage of the total lander's mass. Whereas with the National Team, they don't have room or margin for a heavy-duty crane, and offloading this piece of hardware represents a large percentage of its total mass. Either way, lowering the base module from the height of a Starship still entails some risk, especially compared to the simplicity of the Dynetics low-slung lander design. But Starship does have one final trick up its sleeve. It's already a lunar base by itself. Just one landed Starship has more pressurized volume than the entire ISS. Imagine that. The ISS, which has had constant human presence for 20 years straight, as soon as people return to the moon. They have a base larger than any ever constructed in space, enough living space for continuous occupation of the moon for decades to come in the first landing. Now imagine if they permanently landed 3 or 4 of them. Starship size is often talked about, but perhaps not enough. The floor plan can get crazy with up to 325 square meters, or 3,500 square feet. Just to put that in perspective, that means Starship has as much floor space as this house. So yeah, the Starship lander is kind of like bringing your middle-class American home to the surface of the moon. It honestly doesn't even make a lot of sense to compare the floor space of Starship to the other landers, but let's take a look since comparing is what this video is all about. Based on the models I've made of the landers, the National Team's ILV should have close to 4.7 square meters of floor space for the astronauts. The Dynetics Alpaca will give them a total of 5 square meters. So let's take a look at all the landers' floor space side by side, and we'll throw in the Apollo lander just to see how far we've come. Yeah, Starship is out there. So to recap our second criteria, when it comes to base building, National Team has a challenge to get these large base modules from the payload deck to the surface, but I believe in them, so we're going to give them a strong 15 out of 30. Dynetics, on the other hand, has a great design for dropping off base modules, and they honestly would have scored higher if it wasn't for the fact that the competition in this department is a little unfair, so they're going to end up with a 25 out of 30. And as for SpaceX, Starship is essentially cheating when it comes to base building, but credit where credit is due, 30 for 30. On to our next criteria, design, which is worth 20 points. This criteria is sort of a catch-all for my overall thoughts on the landing systems, as well as how I think their designs can impact science and safety considerations. So let's get started as usual with the National Team. I've got to be honest here, the National Team design leaves a lot to be desired. I don't want to sit here and just rag on it, but as far as standout features, I'm not sure it has any. Dynetics has the low slung design, SpaceX has the crazy size, but the ILS has, I don't know. As stated in the last category, I believe the ILS would have the hardest time unloading payloads, so that's already not great, but it gets worse with astronauts. Here's a diagram showing the impressive height of the ILS ladder. Moving around in an EVA suit is difficult. Climbing a 30+ foot ladder in one is simply dangerous. In a nightmare scenario, a fall from the top of this ladder would result in an astronaut impacting the surface at 6 meters per second, or about 13 miles per hour. That's enough to cause some damage to the suit, or even worse, the astronaut themselves. Now I know what you're thinking. These are professional astronauts and they're not going to fall. And you're probably right, but you have to prepare for the worst, which is exactly what NASA does. And one way I could see NASA doing this is by using a tether and clip system like they use for moving around the ISS. Being cautious and taking solutions like this are important, but they add a lot of time to a mission that could otherwise be spent conducting science. Honestly, the best part of the ILS design is its technical simplicity. It won't rack up a lot of points in this category, however, because there's an entire criteria devoted to that, but it's still worth mentioning. Now let's talk about the Dynetics Alpaca. I love that Dynetics took a very different and interesting approach with their lander design. A single element lander is simple and unique. The low slung design is genius and is without a doubt the best of the bunch when it comes to unloading cargo and astronauts alike. But there is one concern. With Alpaca, due to its small size or payload constraints, Dynetics have said that it's only capable of hosting 2 astronauts on the lunar surface initially. It's actually capable of bringing down 4 astronauts at a time, but it can't keep them all on its stay during the surface, until there's a base module on the moon that can support the extra 2 astronauts. Now, the national team and Dynetics landers are very close to the same size. In fact, I think Dynetics actually has a slight size advantage here. So it could be that the national team has this exact same constraint. However, no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find any mention of this. So I'm gonna have to dock points from Dynetics here, while giving national team the benefit of the doubt. Just keep that in mind. Let's finish this category by taking a look at the Starship. Like the national team, this lander is very tall. However, an elevator for the people and cargo solved the majority of the safety concerns, since astronauts will simply have to stand rather than climb. However, this elevator is still riskier and slower than having a payload compartment that's right next to the surface like Dynetics. Starship will also lose out on a couple of points due to its lack of optimization. It requires a lot of refuelings, and although we hope these become trivial in the future, as of now they are a mission event and that entails some risk. The positives of Starship, however, is of course its size. This is a good time to actually look at the habitable volume of each of the landers. Before, we just looked at the floor space to walk around on when they're on the moon. As you can see, SpaceX has 1,000 cubic meters of room to play with. Look how small that astronaut is next to it. Going to the national team's lander, the IOV has 12.4 cubic meters of space for its 4 astronauts and all the science equipment. You can see how space starts to get pretty tight. The story isn't much different for Dynetics, which has an estimated volume of 14.5 cubic meters. Again, the volumes for national team and Dynetics are based on the models I made for this video, but I try to get it as accurate as possible. So as we take a look at the internal volumes of the 3 landers beside one another, you can really see how different Starship is. It gets even more apparent when you directly compare the landers. In terms of volume, one Starship has as much space as 80 national teams' ILS landers. As for Dynetics, it would take 69 Alpacas to make up the volume of one Starship. Nice. So that's great, but what's the big deal? Didn't I already cover all of this in the base building? Well, yeah, but I want to highlight the other benefit that Starship's massive size gives you, and that is margins. Margins are the biggest challenge in all space operations. Every piece of science equipment going down to the moon's surface has huge size and weight constraints. Each cubic centimeter and kilogram that one payload consumes is substantial, So the design and engineering that goes into optimizing each and every piece is mind-boggling. Starship's huge payload mass and volume capabilities make every part of mission planning easier. Science payloads don't even amount to a rounding error in mass or volume. Most of the compromises engineers must make in traditional spacecraft design simply go out of the window. A source from NASA discussing the Starship lander is quoted in Space News saying, "SpaceX's proposal provides substantial mission design flexibility and dramatically reduces the time and cost associated with transitioning into sustainable phase mission operations." So when it comes to design, the national team's lackluster feature set and precarious ladder hurt its score and leave it with just a 5 out of 20. Dynetics design overall is amazing, and it would have gotten a perfect score, but only being able to bring 2 astronauts to the surface does hurt. We already are limited by SLS to taking just 4 astronauts to the moon each year. Cutting that already tiny number in half isn't great. Still, it's a strong showing at 15 out of 20. SpaceX's design is also promising, getting big marks for its unique capabilities and positive effect on mission design. However, the tall design and copious amounts of refueling due to its dry mass shave some points away, leaving it with a 15 out of 20 as well. Now we move on to the challenge criteria. Doing a moon lander is hard, but as I've said before, I think all 3 of these landers are more than feasible, and any one of them, if selected, will eventually be made to work. And while my primary concern with Artemis isn't speed, it would be nice to get there as fast as possible, and the lander design that seems to have the easiest path to completion should be rewarded in some way. So this is where the national team excels. For better or worse, this lander is not ambitious. The national team followed NASA's request for proposals to a T, and they've designed a very simple lander, not all that different from the one that successfully landed humans many times on the moon 50 years ago. The only challenging part of this lander is its multiple in-space rendezvous required to build it, and we're getting pretty good at that. And if that's the biggest worry your moon lander design has, then you're looking pretty good. On top of this, the national team has already completed several milestones on their way to prove out their system, so they get a perfect 10 out of 10 here. The Dynetics Alpaca is also pretty straightforward. While their lander isn't assembled from multiple pieces, they still have to do refueling rendezvous with 3 fuel tanks. Now that's not too hard, but then you actually have to transfer the propellant. A lot of people like to say that refueling tech is completely unproven. It's not. We've been refueling the ISS for a while now, but large quantities of cryogenic fuel around the moon is certainly a little harder. Besides refueling, which I don't view as a major hurdle, the Alpaca is very straightforward. Dynetics, like National Team, has completed several tests and even has a unique test campaign where Alpaca's main engine will be used to land on the moon later this year with the Astrobotics Peregrine CLPS lander. So I'm giving Alpaca a 9 out of 10, just because the refueling could prove a little tricky. Starship is a bit of a weird one. On one hand, we've all seen the incredible pace of progress SpaceX is making with Starship in Boca Chica. Now, some have said that these tests aren't related to the lunar variant, but this is simply incorrect. First off, Lunar Starship is overall simpler than a normal Starship. The only additional technology are the 9 new landing engines, specially designed for landing on the moon. Every other change is subtractive. No more heat shield, no more body flaps, header tanks, a more traditional docking port placement, simpler, lighter legs, and so forth. More importantly, all the things they are working on in Boca are needed for the HLS proposal. Without Super Heavy, the Lunar Starship can't get to orbit. Without normal starships refueling the Lunar Starship, it can't get to the moon. And without normal starships being able to land and be reused, the system isn't likely to be cost competitive. And there's the rub. Despite at least outwardly showing the fastest pace, the to-do list for Starship is much longer than the other bids. For starters, it's the only option who literally has to develop a new and unproven launch vehicle. Without Super Heavy, it's going nowhere. And then you have the refueling requirement. which is a technical challenge in itself. Starship has to transfer the most amount of fuel the most amount of times out of all the proposals. Then they have to develop the normal Starship in order to do the refueling flights, and there's never even been a reusable second stage, let alone a rapidly reusable second stage. They have to develop the brand new landing engines, and on top of all of this, it's the largest thing ever proposed to land on the moon, which will be viewed as a challenge in its own right. So needless to say, SpaceX has their work cut out for them, but the majority of the work is stuff they were already planning to do and have been actively working on for years. So they'll get 1 out of 10 points simply due to the astounding amount of progress so far. And now for my last and least requirement. It's the On to Mars criteria. This is extra credit and only worth 5 points because, as I've said before, I think lunar landers should be graded on how they land on the moon, not Mars. But it would be nice to do both, so let's take a look at the bids real fast. The national teams ILS and Dynetics Alpaca simply cannot land on Mars, which makes total sense. I'm gonna give the ILS 1 point for having complete ISRU capabilities, which could be used on Mars when we go. Dynetics, I'm afraid, doesn't get a point here. Now Starship is in a hilarious spot here, because while the lunar Starship can't land on Mars, the normal Starship is specifically designed for, and in fact exists, to fulfill this exact purpose. So Starship has to get a 5 out of 5 here, because every bit of development for the HLS Starship would be progress for the Mars Starship as well. We made it! I now have my final scores for the 3 landers based on my criteria. So let's just take a look at the totals before I give my final thoughts. SpaceX Lunar Starship takes the top spot with an 86 out of 100. Not including the extra credit, the Starship gets an impressive 81 points, in large part due to its great performance in the top 2 criteria of sustainability and base building. The Dynetics Alpaca finishes in a very close second with a final score of 79 out of 100. Just 2 points separate Dynetics and Starship if you throw out the Mars criteria, which just goes to show you how these 2 very different proposals can do the same job rather well. And if it's worth anything, Alpaca definitely comes in first place in the name department. This of course leaves the national team's ILS lander in third place. The ILS earned a total of 46 points, and 45 if Mars isn't in the mix. The high cost and non-reusable design, coupled with the awkward payload deck and ladder situation, really held this lander back. So I'm gonna wrap this video up by sharing what I've learned through the process of making this video, and some of my general thoughts about Artemis and its potential landers. Alright, so the elephant in the room. I must obviously hate the national team and its lander, or it must be a horrible design, because its score is like half of the other bids. This isn't true. I really tried to be as unbiased as possible here. And as I've said before, at the end of the day, this lander could do what it's designed to do, and that is bring people to the surface of the moon. Now obviously, based on my criteria for Artemis, I think the other landers could perform that task better, but NASA might not share that opinion. Which is a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is what's my prediction for what NASA will choose. Oddly enough, my prediction is pretty much the opposite of the scores that the landers got in this video, and I'll explain why. I have a feeling NASA prioritized timeline and risk over everything else. While my criteria focused highly on sustainability and base building and giving out points for special design features like the low-slung design of the Alpaca, NASA is risk averse if they are anything. The national team's proposal is a word-for-word match to what NASA asked the industry to do. I mean, just look at this slide from a NASA industry forum about HLS from early 2019. It's basically just a bad drawing of the national team's proposal. And when you look at the criteria that NASA is currently grading these proposals against, technical approach is their most important criteria. And at the top of that category, schedule and risk. Right away, I think this puts Starship in dead last for NASA. think it's safe to say that if NASA only thinks it has enough money to fund one lander, there is a 0% chance SpaceX gets the contract. NASA sees the entire Starship lander as nothing but risk after risk. On the other hand, the Starship's capabilities, shown throughout this video, are just mesmerizing, and they are offering it at the lowest price. For many of us, if we were NASA, I think it'd be a no-brainer to just say, hey, it's super cheap, let's pick either the national team or Dynetics, and then give SpaceX the measly $2 billion they want over the next 6 years or so, just to see what happens. It's low risk, high reward, monetarily speaking, and I think this is SpaceX's best shot at getting the nod. One thing I'm left wondering though is, does NASA even care that Starship can do this much? I'm honestly not sure. The HLS is meant to bring just 4 people a year down to the moon. That's all SLS and Orion can bring. SpaceX has basically proposed an aircraft carrier to someone looking for a fishing boat, but at less than half the cost of the other 2 fishing boats. It's hard not to be attracted to the aircraft carrier, but at the end of the day, NASA might just not care about the extra features, as all 3 boats can do what they need them to do. So I guess I might as well embarrass myself on my first video and firmly submit my predictions that will probably be proven wrong within the next few weeks. I think NASA's top priority is to keep all 3. If they can only keep 2, my guess is National Team and Dynetics will get it, and SpaceX will get kicked out. Now in the worst case where NASA can only keep 1, I think it's a 50-50 toss-up between Dynetics and National Team, because something tells me when National Team resubmitted their proposals, they found a way to shave a few billion off the price tag. And I think that'll be enough to sway NASA their direction. Out of the 2, I'd hope they choose Dynetics, and while the risks are similar, I think NASA will go to whoever they evaluate as having the least risk, which would be the National Team. So that does it for my first YouTube video. I want to thank anyone who stayed all the way through. I know it was a long one, but I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something and formed your own opinion about these awesome landers. I'm looking forward to creating all kinds of opinion and analysis videos about everything space. So if you like what you saw today, feel free to subscribe or follow me on my Twitter, and leave a comment if there's any topics you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you have any tips for a new YouTuber. I'll see all of you soon in the next video.